Welcome back. This lesson focuses on what historians have called the conquered generation. So we talked about post-Mexican independence. I believe I showed you a video on the U.S.-Mexico War and how the U.S. basically stole the American Southwest. At least it comes off that way, right? And from the perspective of that video, there's obviously a lot of truth to that. And then addressing now we're going to look at what Chicano historians have labeled the conquered generation. So these years are roughly between 1848 to about 1900. And when we think of generations, think of the baby boom generation, think of the X generation or your generation. I don't know what they're called, but there's certain defining characteristics that are associated with each generation. So we're going to be looking at generations as we move forward. So keep that in mind. So between these key years, there's a certain ideology that kind of shapes this particular generations. And this is about 50 years worth of history. I'll probably cut this lecture into two because it's pretty long, but definitely going to look at different aspects of what happens to Mexican people once they get conquered. And this is that great example. If you ever heard the line of "We did not cross the border crossed us." This is where this comes from, where literally a border crossed the people that were already living here. So, and I think that video did a nice job. It addresses some of the politics of the era where the United States could have taken all of Mexico, and because of this kind of racism that existed, and it's true, I think it was Calhoun, kind of made the point of like, why do we want to take everybody, or why do we want to take all Mexico? Because then we got to take everybody. We don't want everybody, right? We just want the land. So this kind of creates the conflict during this period too. So we begin by looking at the treaty. As the video noted, there is a treaty between the United States and Mexico called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And this treaty basically sets the conditions as to how, what's going to happen to this territory and the people within it. So just to give you some information, it's signed in February 2nd, 1848. And for the most part, it's kept intact with the exception of Article 10, which is deleted. And the question that we have to ask is, well, why was this particular article deleted? And it'll relate to something that we talked about earlier. So just to give you some information that you ought to know is Article 7, just to kind of read it out loud. In consideration of the extension acquired by the boundaries of the United States as defined in the 5th article of the present treaty, the government of the United States engages to pay to that of the Mexican Republic the sum of $15 million. And basically this is that idea that the U.S. will pay Mexico this much money. You have to understand that as Americans, we don't see ourselves as colonizers. Even though we own colonies, right? Puerto Rico and a bunch of islands in the Pacific, the United States doesn't like to call itself a colonizing nation like the British or the French because of our ideals. The reality is quite different, right? We actually do own a lot of things, and we took things in a very deceiving way. Hawaii being a great example of that, and what happened here. So as the video noted, right, we wanted to pay Mexico initially for California. California was always the ultimate goal because California gives you access to new markets, right? Yeah, Colorado's interesting and might have something there. Arizona, it's the desert, right? Or maybe the Grand Canyon, but there's no tourism at this time, so who cares about the Grand Canyon? But California, I mean, that's the Emerald City right there because it has a coast, and that coast opens up a lot of opportunities. So yeah, we paid $15 million. Let's look at Article 9. This one's important, particularly for the people who are here. So the Mexican who, in the territories aforesaid, shall not preserve the character of citizens of the Mexican Republic, conformably with what is stipulated in the preceding article, shall be incorporated into the Union of the United States and be admitted at the proper time, to be judged of by the Congress of the United States, to the enjoyment of all the rights of citizens of the United States, according to the principles of the Constitution, and in the meantime shall be maintained and protected in the free enjoyment of their liberty and property, and secured in the free exercise of their religion without restrictions. This one's really key, because it addresses so much. Now, this is something that I also address in my Chicano Studies class because it's that important. But if we break it down, basically what this says is that the United States is going to make these people into U.S. citizens that are protected under the Constitution. So unlike African Americans who come in as slaves, right? People come into the United States in different statuses. Mexicans come in as part of this nation as full U.S. citizens. So our ancestors are U.S. citizens. So they should be treated like any other American citizens that are protected by this document called the Constitution. Obviously, reality is quite different. And if you continue reading, that they should should be maintained and protected under the free enjoyment of their liberty and property, right? This is another important element, that their property will be protected. So this becomes significant when squatters begin to move into the West. So things change, and what we find is that a lot of negotiation was taking place. But when the Protocol of Querétaro came about, which is in May, right? The other document was signed in February. This is in May, a couple months later. They made some changes, and this one kind of sticks with this, with what actually happened. So Article 10 from the original treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, argued all grants of land made by the Mexican government or by the competent authorities in territories previously appertaining to the Mexico and remaining for the future within the limits of the United States shall be respected as valid, to the same extent that the same grants would be valid to the said territories had remained within the limits of Mexico. So the original Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo argued that Mexican people were able to keep their land, no questions asked, right? Their land grants are valid. And so some of these land grants, you have to understand, go back generations, 1700s or 1800s, 1830s. That's when a good number of them were given out. So the original treaty said, your land, no questions asked, we're not going to take it away from you. But then things change. So this protocol made a slight change to this question about land. And it said, the American government, by suppressing the 10th article of the treaty, did not in any way intend to annul the grants of land made by Mexico in the ceded territories. These grants, notwithstanding the suppression of the article of the treaty, preserve the legal value which they may possess, and the grantee may cause their legitimate titles to be acknowledged before an American tribunal. So what this one is arguing is basically that the person who owns the land, which are Mexicans, now have to bring their documentation and basically prove that it is their land. So everything falls on them to justify that this is their territory in order for them to keep it. The original treaty said the opposite, right? It's your land, we took it, we took this territory, but you get to keep your land. This one's saying the opposite. Now you got to prove to us that it is your land, right? And you can see how problematic that becomes. Remember, I told you in the last lectures, boundaries. That becomes a major issue here. So that's the treaty and the Protocol Querétaro. All right, let's move on. You have to understand that during this period, as as the Americans begin to move west, they see the land in a particular way that the Mexicans don't. Even before the war, the American people argued constantly that Mexicans don't know how to use the land correctly. Therefore, they should not have it. Again, very kind of racist rhetoric that emerges. It's just that Mexicans used it differently from the Americans. But there's a very famous historian. His name is Frederick Jackson Turner, and he wrote this very important um, argument called, his thesis, that kind of defined the concept of the American West. He says America is great because, there's always been a lot of land out there, right? And this has allowed America to extend and grow from generation to generation. So Americans have seen the West as a place of opportunity, right? I mean, America is defined as that kind of concept, right? America's the land of opportunity. Well, the West helped create that. Because as we got crowded in the East Coast, what happened? People just migrated west, right? And settled some territories. And here you have images, right, of, this concept that's called manifest destiny, right? That it's our God-given right as Americans to move west and take it all over. So they develop, and please pay close attention here, because they develop this concept of rugged individualism. So this idea is still very grounded in the American psyche, even today. This notion that if you work hard, you will succeed, right? That's that concept of rugged individualism. There might be an element of truth, but for the most part, it's kind of BS, right? And it's always been BS in American history. Um, the only way people become rich is through crooked means. There's not an honest rich person in the world. I don't think, and maybe there's one or two. Right? Sorry, I don't mean to stereotype, but particularly during this period, people became rich in very crooked ways. But the belief is that the rugged individual came to the West and built it. Have you ever watched the show Adam Ruins Everything? He does a great episode on the West, and it's always presented as, American white males came to the West. The cowboy settled it, right? Settled the West, and he does a great show addressing the truth of actually, well, who settles the West, and I guess who civilizes it, and put that in quotes. And he basically comes up, it's hookers. Hookers settled the West. Hookers along with other people, but it's just kind of fun. It's a funny argument because that's probably more true than this concept of rugged individualism. All right, I suggest you watch it. Also, the concept of the West is tied to less government. I mean, the whole kind of Texas rebellion in the 1830s was based on this idea of turning against the central federal government in Mexico, telling them what to do. You can't tell us what to do, Mexico, right? We're over here in this frontier. We can govern ourselves, basically. And the West is kind of built around that idea of less government. So I already talked about hard work equals success, and again, that's more of that myth. And I'm going to show you examples of this, so don't think I'm just list Pablo's opinions. This is all based on historical documentation. And then also that Euro-Americans, are coming west to civilize and bring democracy to this barbaric world that we call the Southwest. So if you follow politics at all, this is pretty much the mantra of the conservative movement from the 1960s forward, and it's actually created by your very own Barry Goldwater. So if you're, watch Barry Goldwater back in the 1960s, he came out with a book during that time when he ran for president, and he basically argues this ideology. So it's still in play, and again, he makes it sound like hard work made him successful. If you ever look at his past, he comes from money. So it's kind of interesting how people use that kind of rugged individualism to justify their actions. So as Americans begin to come west, they come, but remember that they take other people's land. After the treaty is signed, they actually discover, I think a couple weeks after the treaty is signed, they discover gold. And after 1848, you see this massive growth in population in places like California. So right, oh there it is, right, 1 week before the signing of the treaty, you see just California increase in population. So by 1849, there's about 100,000 people migrating to California. And what happens with the people who are already here, remember I mentioned, I mean, if you ever go to places like Los Angeles or even, anywhere in California, you see these Spanish names like Castillo Street, De la Guerra Hall. There's all these Spanish surnames throughout places like Los Angeles. And that's because these people once owned this territory, right? Again, Pico Rivera. Pico Rivera is related to Pio Pico, right? So when this takeover happens, right? When the United States takes over the Mexican territory, these Mexicans who are here own all this territory now, but now it's up to them to prove that it's their territory. So in California, this is just one example. It happens in New Mexico and other places too. There's a California Land Act of 1851 where basically these Mexican people, or Spanish, had to prove that it is their territory. And they had to submit documentation, right, to prove that it's their land and submit it to this commission. Now, this whole process is very crooked. And there's kind of ways to kind of cheat people. So one way is that, many of these Mexicans don't know the law. You just became a citizen of a new country where the laws are completely different. So, what do you need? You need a lawyer to help you in this process, right? So this whole process gets very complicated and very expensive. And these Dons are not rich. They own thousands and thousands of acres, but it's not like they have, a lot of money in the bank. They're wealthy in land, but they have to pay these people to help this whole process be documented. And a lot of times they end up partitioning their territory, saying, well, in order to pay the lawyer, I'll give them a piece of land, right? And it just kind of gets, slowly but surely their land gets chipped, and they begin to lose it. And just to give you an idea, the whole process on average took about 17 years. Most of you probably have barely been alive 17 years. And some of these people, it took that long to prove that it's their territory. So, okay, that's happening, right? Mexicans having to prove that's their land. Now, squatters, and by squatters we mean basically freeloading Americans who are moving from the East Coast to the West Coast that are taking other people's land. Now, even today, squatters have rights. I remember during the recession of 2008, people were walking away from their homes, but then particularly like really expensive homes in places like Florida. And sometimes, people would just go in there and squat. And there's certain laws in the books that if you stay there long enough, then it becomes yours. It's a whole process. So the point really is that squatters have rights, right? And the United States created this it's called the Preemption Act of 1841, which is basically a squatter rights law throughout the United States. Now this impacts California too, though. All right, and what happens here is that the American government basically opens up territory for people to squat on, right, to take and to purchase from the U.S. government. And they did this, you probably have read about the Homestead Act, right? They open up Western territory, and they are able to purchase this territory very cheaply, or at least those people that have money. And kind of quickly, this law is used throughout the United States. And in places like California, there's public domain land, but it tends to be in really bad places, probably like Phoenix, right? It's just the desert and certain valleys that don't have maybe a lot of water resources. So they end up not really able to sustain themselves. So they come from the East Coast to places like California, end up in the Mojave Desert, and it's like, what are we going to grow here, right? So they kind of continue into better land. And when it comes to this kind of public domain land, a lot of times they had to buy a large piece of property. And like I mentioned earlier with the Homestead Act, a lot of people don't have a lot of money. So the people that were buying land were people that already had money. I think you kind of see that today where like they're saying, oh, it's a good time to buy a house. Yeah, if you have money, if you have a job, right? But what about the rest of us? So it kind of creates this major wedge. Those people who have money to invest can afford to buy homes and land. Those that don't continue to be poor. Same thing is happening here. Your average squatter could not afford to buy this territory. And then you had to pay for the process too. Again, you don't have that much money as a squatter, as a poor American trying to start something. You just don't have that money. So this kind of hurts you because you can't buy that land. So what do? Well, there's other land, in better land in different parts of California, and you go to these places and you take it. Why? Because this is as American as apple pie, right? Taking other people's land is the American pastime, right? Since 1619, whenever we settled this country, that's what we've been doing. And it's just part of that American psyche, right? It's just what we do. All right, I'm gonna stop it here, take a quick break, and then start it all over again, looking at the aftermath.